Fossil Creek. It's located just outside of Payson. It's becoming a popular Arizona hotspot. In fact, too popular.
A geologist walked into an Arizona canyon in the fall of 2005, ran his hand across a boulder he had touched the year before, and stopped cold. The rock was different. Not eroded, not weathered, built. Something had added material to solid stone in the space of a single season, and in his entire career, he had only ever seen the ground change that fast when something was being destroyed. This time, it was being made. For 96 years, a concrete wall in central Arizona had done something almost nobody questioned. It quietly killed a river by doing exactly what it was designed to do. Then, in 2005, engineers shut it down, and within weeks, that river began performing a trick that shouldn't have been possible after a century of silence. This is the story of Fossil Creek, and it is not a simple story about a dam coming out and nature healing itself. It is a story about how removing a barrier can save an ecosystem and, at the very same moment, nearly destroy it, and about the uncomfortable truth scientists eventually had to accept about what actually brings a river back to life. To understand why any of this mattered, you first have to understand that Fossil Creek was never an ordinary Arizona waterway. Most desert streams in the American Southwest are unreliable by nature. They roar during monsoon season, tear out roads and fence lines, and then vanish into dry sand within days, leaving nothing behind but a memory of water. Fossil Creek does not behave that way, and it never has. Tucked into a canyon below the Mogollon Rim, between the small communities of Camp Verde and Strawberry, the creek is born not from snowmelt or gradual tributary buildup, but from a cluster of artesian springs that push out roughly 43 cubic feet of water per second, every day, in wet years and dry ones alike. The water temperature barely shifts across the seasons. In a state defined by scarcity, Fossil Creek is defined by constancy, a river that simply exists at full strength the instant it reaches daylight. What makes the creek even more unusual is what's dissolved in that water. As it travels underground through limestone formations under pressure, it picks up enormous quantities of calcium carbonate, far more than it can hold once it reaches the surface and open air. The moment that water hits atmosphere, it begins releasing carbon dioxide, and the chemistry tips. The dissolved mineral has nowhere to go but out of solution, so it precipitates, clinging to fallen branches, mats of algae, tangles of moss. Layer upon layer, over months and years, ordinary organic debris becomes encased in a rock-like mineral called travertine. 19th-century travelers moving through the canyon in the 1860s found sticks and leaves along the banks that looked exactly like fossils, hardened, sheathed in pale mineral crust, and that is how the creek got its name. But travertine doesn't just coat debris. Over time, it builds actual structures, low, curved dams across the creek's own channel, natural formations that pond water into brilliant turquoise pools. Water spills over each mineral wall, degasses further, drops more sediment, and the wall grows taller while the pool behind it deepens. Multiply that process downstream again and again, and an entire canyon transforms into a staircase of pools, cascades, and terraces, engineered by nothing but chemistry and time. Around that architecture, one of the richest desert ecosystems in the state assembled itself. Dozens of tree and shrub species, more than 100 bird species, river otters, beavers, a suite of bats, threatened frogs, and eventually 9 native fish species found almost nowhere else in such concentration. Then, in 1900, a rancher named Lou Turner purchased the water rights to Fossil Creek, and within a few years those rights passed to interests with far larger ambitions. By 1909, engineers had built a concrete diversion dam roughly 25 feet high across the channel, an extraordinary feat given that no road existed into the canyon. Crews hauled cement, steel, and timber down by mule team and improvised cable systems, constructing nearly 8,800 feet of flumes, tunnels, and pipeline to redirect almost the entire flow of Fossil Creek out of its natural bed and down to a powerhouse. The result was the Childs Irving Hydroelectric Project, and for its era, it was a genuine marvel of engineering, later recognized as a historic mechanical landmark and added to the National Register of Historic Places. The electricity it generated powered the copper mines at Jerome and, eventually, a growing city called Phoenix. Nobody involved in building it set out to destroy anything. But Fossil Creek's entire identity depended on water moving across exposed rock in open air, and once that water was funneled into pipes, the machine that built the canyon simply switched off. Below the diversion, the creek didn't run completely dry. Seepage, side tributaries, and storm runoff kept a trickle alive. But the volume required to keep building Travertine was gone, and the consequences were structural. Without water constantly moving and degassing across them, the mineral dams stopped growing, and dams that aren't actively maintained don't sit quietly forever. Floods punched holes through the old Travertine walls, and with nothing coming behind to repair them, the pools drained out one by one over decades. Native fish were squeezed into whatever isolated pockets of water still held reliably, and that's when a second threat arrived from the opposite direction. Non-native predators, smallmouth bass, flathead catfish, green sunfish, moved upstream from the Verde River, perfectly suited to the slow, warm, degraded water the lower creek had become. Crayfish, introduced into Arizona waterways in the 1970s, spread through the lower reaches and stripped the system from the bottom of the food web upward. The native fish were now caught in a vise, a dewatered channel behind them that could no longer produce habitat, and a wall of introduced predators pressing up the canyon from below. Here is where the story turns genuinely strange, because the same dam that was slowly killing Fossil Creek's downstream ecosystem was also the only thing standing between those predators and the pristine springs above. Remove the wall, and you don't just restore the water. You hand the invaders a clear highway straight into the last stronghold of native fish. That contradiction sat unresolved for years, not because nobody cared, but because there was no clean way to solve it. What eventually forced the issue wasn't activism or litigation. It was paperwork. Every hydroelectric project in the United States operates under a federal license, and those licenses expire. Childs Irving had been granted a 50-year term, and by the early 1990s that term was running out. In 1992, Arizona Public Service applied to renew it, and under ordinary circumstances that would have been a formality. But the arithmetic behind the project had quietly shifted. In 1909, a few megawatts of hydroelectric power were remarkable. By the 1990s, against a regional grid running on massive coal plants and Colorado River hydropower, that same output was a rounding error, propped up by aging, high-maintenance infrastructure. Conservation groups seized on the renewal application and pressed federal regulators with an uncomfortably simple question. If this project generates almost nothing, and the cost of that generation is the only creek of its kind in Arizona, what exactly is being licensed here? Remarkably, the dispute didn't collapse into a decade of lawsuits. It became a negotiation, bringing together the utility, the U.S. Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the Yavapai Apache Nation, Arizona Game and Fish, Northern Arizona University researchers, and a coalition of conservation organizations. In 1999, the utility agreed to surrender its license, and in 2004 federal regulators formally approved that surrender, ruling that restoring the creek held greater value than continuing to generate power there. It made Fossil Creek only the second dam in American history removed purely for environmental reasons, following the 1999 removal of the Edwards Dam from Maine's Kennebec River. But there was a crucial difference. The Edwards Dam came out partly to benefit Atlantic salmon and shad, commercially valuable fish with an economy behind them. Fossil Creek was being restored for desert suckers, long-fin dace, and round-tail chub, species that carried no market value whatsoever. Their only argument for existing was that they belonged there, and the country had never removed a dam for that reason before. Before the water could be turned back on, though, something had to be done that still makes people flinch decades later. Crews couldn't simply reopen the channel, because doing so with smallmouth bass and flathead catfish already established downstream would have handed the invaders exactly the highway everyone feared. So in 2004, the Bureau of Reclamation and its partners built a permanent fish barrier roughly 5 miles upstream from where Fossil Creek meets the Verde River, at a point where bedrock naturally narrowed the channel. Everything above that barrier would be defended. Everything below it was written off in advance. 5 miles of creek conceded as the price of saving the rest. Then came the part that never makes it into a celebratory press release. Researchers applied a pesticide called antimycin A through the stretch between the new barrier and the old diversion dam, a chemical that attacks gill-breathing organisms and kills virtually every fish in the water it touches. Before that poison went in, crews had to physically remove every native fish they could find by hand. working pool by pool with nets and buckets through the fall, counting each animal, carrying them to holding tanks upstream. Headwater chub, round-tail chub, Sonora sucker, desert sucker, speckled dace and long-fin dace, each one lifted out of the only water it had ever known. There is no fast version of that work. Every undercut bank, every root tangle, every shaded ledge had to be checked twice, because a missed fish was a fish that would die for nothing. Crews stood in cold canyon water holding a meaningful share of the surviving population of several distinct species, fully aware that if the barrier failed, if the tanks failed, if the restocking failed, they would not be remembered as conservationists but as the people who finished the job the dam had started. Research out of Northern Arizona University later confirmed that the treatment did cause significant mortality among aquatic invertebrates too, the insects that anchor the food web, though those effects proved relatively short-lived. Still, the honest accounting of 2004 is that a stream was deliberately sterilized in order to save it, at a cost of roughly $1.1 million. Then, in June of 2005, the flumes were shut down and the diversion ended. For the first time since 1909, the full 43 cubic feet per second flowed exactly where gravity had always intended, filling plunge pools that had sat half-empty for a century and soaking gravel that hadn't been properly wet since before the First World War. It was the first time any desert stream in the American Southwest had been restored to its full natural flow, and there was no precedent to measure it against. Restoration ecologists who had spent years pushing for this moment were quietly uneasy, because the field is full of projects where water was returned and almost nothing came back, habitat degraded past the point of recovery, seed banks dead, species gone from a region entirely, leaving behind nothing but a clean, wet, empty channel. Careful models predicted gradual recovery over years, even decades. Nobody's model predicted what actually happened within weeks. The travertine came back first, not the fish, not the vegetation, the stone itself. The chemistry that had been switched off for 96 years turned back on the instant water returned to the open channel, plating fresh mineral onto branches and moss, sealing old breaches, rebuilding the step pool staircase along reaches that had been bare since before anyone alive had been born. The geologist tracking the site reported deposition happening at roughly a couple of centimeters per year, a rate that sounds modest until you remember it isn't sediment settling, it's solid rock being assembled in real time out of dissolved mineral, fast enough to document across just a handful of field seasons. That mattered because the new travertine wasn't just decoration. Every pond pool it created was fresh habitat, deep water with slow margins, hiding places for juvenile fish, spots where leaf litter could collect and feed the invertebrates that fed everything above them. Which raised the only question anyone actually cared about: was any of this working for the fish that had nearly disappeared? Researchers built a study with genuine rigor, splitting monitoring across 4 treatment reaches in a before-after control impact design. One where flow was restored and invasive fish had never been present, one where flow was restored and invasives were actively removed, one where flow was restored but invasives were left alone, and one untouched control. That structure finally isolated a question nobody had been able to answer cleanly before. Was it the water, or the removal of invaders that actually drove native fish recovery? The results were stark. Where flow was restored and non-native fish were eliminated, native fish abundance increased more than 50-fold. Where flow was restored but the invaders remained, the response was minimal. Bass and sunfish stayed, and the natives simply didn't recover. And the financial comparison reshaped how people talked about river restoration afterward. Restoring the flow had cost roughly $12 million. Removing the invasive fish had cost roughly $1.1 million. The cheaper, uglier intervention did dramatically more. The romantic idea that freeing a river's water is enough, that nature will simply handle the rest, does not survive contact with what Fossil Creek's own data showed. By 2008, with the water, the stone, and the native fish all trending in the right direction, crews returned to dismantle what remained of the original diversion dam, removing the flumes and access roads and replanting native vegetation across the scars. But not all of the old concrete came out. A portion was deliberately left standing, a low remnant wall positioned to do one specific job: physically obstruct the upstream movement of invasive fish. The very structure that had dewatered the creek for 96 years was kept in place on purpose, repurposed as a defensive asset for the ecosystem it had spent a century degrading. Recognition followed quickly. In 2009, Congress designated over 16 miles of Fossil Creek as a wild and scenic river, only the second such designation in Arizona, and the state eventually approved a first-of-its-kind blue ribbon catch-and-release fishery for round-tail chub, a native species that had been sliding toward extinction and was now considered valuable enough to protect for sport. But the triumphant version leaves out what happened next. In 2012, that remnant barrier failed, and biologists detected smallmouth bass above it. Inside the protected water everyone believed was secure. Whether it arrived through a flood event, an abandoned bait bucket, or a determined fish finding a route around the wall at high flow mattered less than the fact that the invaders were back inside. Crews repeated the entire brutal process, a second chemical treatment, the same salvage operations, the same nets and holding tanks. Arizona Game and Fish now monitors native populations every single year, and that detail matters more than it sounds. Keeping the creek free of invasive species was never a status Fossil Creek achieved once and kept. It's a job somebody performs annually, indefinitely, forever, because the Verde River below the barrier is still full of bass and catfish that will keep testing that wall for as long as it exists. Then a completely different threat arrived from a direction nobody had modeled at all. Photographs of Fossil Creek's turquoise pools spread across social media, and visitation exploded far beyond anything the narrow canyon could absorb. Cars lined the access road, trash accumulated, broken glass turned up in the pools, and trampled banks eroded faster than they could recover. In response, land managers imposed a strict permit system running from April through October, limiting visitors to one reservation per person per month and banning camping, campfires, and glass containers throughout the corridor, a creek rescued from an electric utility now carefully rationed to the very public that came to love it. And in June of 2021, lightning ignited the Backbone Fire, which burned nearly 41,000 acres of the watershed feeding Fossil Creek, forcing evacuations and shutting the recreation area down entirely. The flames themselves were the short part of that story. What follows a burn scar for years afterward is ash, unstable slopes, and debris flows, all draining toward a creek whose entire ecological identity depends on clean water moving over clean rock, an untested variable in a system that had already surprised scientists once. Across the United States, tens of thousands of aging dams sit past their intended design life, producing little or nothing, quietly waiting for the same question Fossil Creek was forced to answer decades early. What that canyon proved wasn't simple, and it wasn't comfortable. It proved that a river silenced for nearly a century can start rebuilding itself in a matter of weeks once given the chance. It proved that returning water alone is not enough, that the unglamorous, difficult work of removing what doesn't belong can matter more than the grand gesture of tearing down a dam. And it proved that recovery is never a finish line. It's a barrier that has to hold, a monitoring program that has to stay funded, a permit system that has to be enforced, a watershed that will eventually burn again. Today, Fossil Creek still runs turquoise and cold through that canyon, carrying 9 native fish species that were reduced to a handful of holdouts only 2 decades ago, still quietly building stone a few centimeters at a time in a channel that sat dead from 1909 until a single June morning in 2005. It is not a story with a clean ending, because rivers don't get clean endings. It is a story about what it actually costs in money, in labor, in uncomfortable decisions, to give a piece of the natural world back its voice, and about the people still standing guard over that decision year after year so that it holds.